Okay, this is John Burroughs again, and I'm going to do chapter 26 of my autobiography, 7 Years to Life. The title of this chapter is called Mercy Trip. It was the summer of 1964 when I met Francis S. He also lived in the Hillsdale Garden Apartments across the street from me. The street was Hillsdale Boulevard, and I happened to be walking on the sidewalk on my way to the local grammar school to shoot some hoops with Eddie. Francis was walking in the same direction, but on the other side of the street. He jogged over to my side of the street, and before I even introduced myself, he asked me where I was headed. I told him where I was going, and he said he was going to visit a girl that lived a block or so further from my destination, and he asked if I minded if he walked with me. I told him that it was all right to do so, and finally he told me his name. After that, he never stopped talking until we had to part ways. His speech was so rapid that it was hard to understand, but in the short span of 2 blocks, I learned quite a bit about him. I enjoyed his company on our short walk, and I decided to get to know him better. Apparently, he had decided the same thing. I had noticed him sitting across the street playing a harmonica, but for whatever reason, neither of us crossed the street to say hello. A couple of days after our initial conversation, I saw Francis sitting outside of his apartment and expected him to cross the street, hopefully, to bring our newfound friendship to a higher level. I waved to him and, speaking through gestures, suggested that he come over. I was baffled when he acted like he did not see me, so I decided to cross to his side of the street to get an idea why he was acting like we had never met. When he noticed me striding in his direction, he got up and intercepted me just as I took my first step on the sidewalk. He put his arm around my shoulders with an unmistakable urgency that led me away from his front door. As he did so, he apologized for pretending not to see me, and went on to tell me that his father and mother were not especially fond of Francis making any friends without their prior approval. The situation was further exacerbated due to the fact that he informed his parents that he was going to be the lead singer for a local band that was forming. He had just got through fighting with his parents and told them whether they liked it or not, it was something he had his mind set on doing, and if they tried to prevent him, he would simply run away and continue to do so, even if it meant they would declare him incorrigible. He then told me he had to go inside and we could talk later. I think Francis was in turmoil because caused by, based on what I know about it today, suffered from ADHD and bipolar disorder, and therein lied the reason for his parents' smothering behavior and concern. Of course, in those days, most people were not even aware that these conditions existed. Over the past 5 years, I've become quite knowledgeable about these conditions, and how I gained that knowledge will be explored later in this book. Of course, at this point in my life, I was entirely unaware of them, but could tell Francis was just a tad different. When I finally met his parents, they questioned me as if I was under oath, and in general made me feel like crap. I know today that it was simply fear that drove their behavior. Over time, Francis and I shared and often discussed our love of music. A couple of weeks later, he came over to my house to tell me that the band was having their first practice and asked me if I would like to attend. All of the band members attended a different high school, and the practice was going to be held at the drummer's house, which was a couple of miles away, and for 2 young teenagers, it was about a 20-minute journey. The practice went very well, and I was genuinely surprised how talented and congenial the other band members were. I became their equipment manager, and within a year's time, the band developed a loyal local following. About 18 months after the band had first got together, things started to fall apart especially with Francis, who became shackled with a severe heroin habit that made him completely unreliable. The other band members, some of which changed over time, decided to try and resurrect their popularity with me as the lead singer, since I knew every word and every harmony part that Francis had been responsible for. It worked for some time, and we were still drawing decent crowds, but without a business manager to keep us motivated, we soon fell apart and went off on different paths. From what I understand, Francis disappeared, and the last one to hear from him said he was still struggling with his addiction. Once again, this had to be told in order to properly set up what this particular story is really about. If you recall the title of the story, Mercy Trip is actually about the first time I took LSD, and Mercy Trip is not about my experience. It is the name of a girl that made it possible for Francis and I to try LSD. Her real first name was Judy, and her last name is unimportant. She was 2 or 3 years older than us and had become part of the emerging San Francisco hippie scene and drug culture. She had been listening to bands like the Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver Messenger Service, and others in small clubs before the Fillmore ever existed. Francis somehow met her in high school before she became Mercy Trip, and they have formed a relationship largely due to her respect for our band. One evening, after band practice, Francis said to me that Mercy Trip was taking him to San Francisco on the upcoming Saturday night so he could try LSD, and he asked me if I would like to come along. My answer was an immediate yes. She had a driver's license and a car. She assured us that she knew who we were going to score the acid from and the location where we had been invited to join others who were going to be dropping also. Before I go on with the story, I want to try and describe as accurately as possible the type of person that over the years I have come to realize about her. Hopefully this will help you to visualize her appearance and get an idea of her personality. She was overweight, though not obese. Her hair was light brown and noticeably unkempt, and her clothes was exactly what you would expect a young hippie girl to wear. In fact, she looked like a picture taken from a magazine article about the hippie movement. She had on a colorful dress that went slightly below her knees and some long flowing scarves that had many other colors that did not even remotely match her dress. On her feet she wore what resembled Roman sandals, where the straps crisscrossed above her feet to just below her knees. On her head there was some sort of real flower arrangement that completed the ensemble. It was also the first time I smelled a fragrance that had become widely used by hippie girls in the 60s, known as patchouli oil. I would not go as far as to call her ugly, but at the same time I would be hard-pressed to refer to her as attractive. She had a wonderful, animated, and optimistic personality, and by her actions and conversations, I think she felt that the future was bright. I could understand why she felt this way, because prior to the hippie movement, I think she was troubled because acceptance by her peers was extremely hard to come by. The hippie culture of the 60s was one of acceptance, regardless of how you looked or any eccentricities that you might have. That was the idea, but no one really practiced it. Usually attractive people went to other attractive people. Her bright outlook was infectious, and you could not help liking her way of approaching life. For the short time that I knew her, I never found her to be judgmental about anyone. Mercy Trip and the 60s hippie culture were a match made in heaven. So, the following Saturday, the three of us headed for San Francisco, where Francis and I would experience our first acid trip. I had not even tried marijuana at this point. On the drive up, Mercy started telling us about some of the people that would be there and the fun we were going to have. I distinctly remember the name of John Cipollina, who I later discovered was the lead guitarist for the Quicksilver Messenger service. As we were driving up there, Mercy pulled off the freeway in a town called Brisbane and said that she had to make a quick stop. She pulled into the parking lot of a small mom-and-pop grocery store, got out of the car, went inside, and 3 minutes later she walked out with a rather large brown bag, and as she got closer to the car, I thought I heard the distinct sound of bottles rattling, which I naturally assumed was liquor of some sort. I was wrong. She had actually purchased 4 bottles of Vicks Formula 44 cough syrup that contained codeine, which provided a different kind of stoned. Codeine was legal at the time, as was LSD, and was sold over the counter in a variety of cough syrups. The whole idea of consuming large amounts of cough syrup for anything other than a cough simply did not appeal to me, and to a certain degree I found it somewhat disgusting. We finally arrived at a Victorian house in the Haight District, and I have tried often, but the street it was on does not come to mind. I did not know at the time, but Mercy had already purchased the hits of acid for the 3 of us. We reimbursed her for the purchase and then followed her into the kitchen, where we were introduced to a number of people, some of which already knew who we were because they had heard our band play. Mercy told us to go ahead and drop the acid, and then she suggested that while the acid was coming on, she would take us on a tour of the house. It seemed each room was designed and painted for different phases of the overall experience. The living room and den had walls mostly lined with books of many esoteric and pseudo-intellectual topics. The furniture was extremely comfortable and placed close together, which gave the overall room a vibe that encouraged conversation and dialogue. The next room we had an atmosphere that was the exact opposite of the living room. The room was made to accommodate soul-searching and meditation. At that immediate moment, I felt a creepiness about it, and at the same time, it definitely piqued my curiosity. The lighting had been removed from the room, which had been painted entirely in black. There was a rope, which was also black, that hung down from the ceiling and had appeared to me that had been placed in the exact center of the room. Additionally, a tire had been tethered to the rope, essentially creating a makeshift swing. I began to feel the LSD start to come on, and the next room we entered was specifically designed to enhance the visual experience that was about to come. The room had lights with bulbs of almost every color imaginable. The walls had outer space-like designs painted on them with glow-in-the-dark paint, and the feeling that was created was surreal to the point that the room gave off a vibe that made you feel like you were in a fantasy parallel universe. I then discovered a feature of the room that I thought was an absolute stroke of genius. As we were exiting the room, I felt a compulsion to pause at the door and turn off all the light switches, which were side by side in a row on the wall. There were 4 switches. I brought my hand down across all 4 of the switches, which extinguished every light bulb in the room. As soon as the bulbs went dark, the room immediately became that fantasy parallel universe as the glow-in-the-dark paint took over. The acid was in full gear by now, and it took the experience to a whole other level. The 3 of us, Mercy, Francis, and I, decided to stay in that room along with some others and soak up the feeling. The last and final room we knew as soon as we walked in was actually a temple to the gods of the hippie movement, music. Of course, what made it so obvious was the sound coming from the room as we approached it. All 4 walls had state-of-the-art speakers attached to them and a music system that filled those speakers with the greatest musicians and singers of both past and present. I cannot even begin to estimate what today's value would be for the hundreds of vinyl albums that were stored in cabinets around the room. There was a rack next to the turntable that could accommodate approximately 20 records at a time. You could take an album of your choice and put it in the rack in the appropriate slot, and when one album ended, someone would go up and put the next album on. I spent time in all four rooms and was amazed that they were perfectly suited for the main moods that people usually encounter when tripping. There was a point when the three of us were in different rooms, tripping with people we had just met, dependent on our mood or feelings. It was truly an unexpected, wonderful experience. Of all the vibes that I felt that night, I never felt a hint of hostility or paranoia. That was not always the case in the days to come when the usual predators came on the scene, and the purity and quality of the LSD being sold hurt and destroyed many people who just did not understand that the purity of the acid that you ingested greatly determined the quality of your experience. On our drive home, early the following morning, we discussed many things. Mercy told us that the residents of that house were the ones that created those magical rooms which enhanced our trip. I don't recall if I ever met or talked to the actual residents, but after that night, I was convinced that genius comes in all forms.